American fighting man, the war in Vietnam was like no other. It was a war that the presidents of the United States would not win. A war in which Congress could not decide upon victory or pullout. A war in which the military leaders refused to speak out about the inadequate numbers of troops being committed to win, or how allowing enemy sanctuary in North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos made victory impossible. Back in the United States, life went on with little interruption. The World Series and Super Bowl were still played. Many young Americans burned their draft cards with immunity, while others fled to Canada. Students on campus called for an end to the war. They called American soldiers baby killers, and the enemy heroes, as they carried the Viet Cong flag. If any group aided the enemy the most, it was the students. They shackled the president and the Congress. The generals remained silent for their own reasons. The United States was a powerful nation, and if the people had supported the war totally, no nation, let alone North Vietnam, could have held out. But the people were not behind the war, and the presidents, Johnson and Nixon, never attempted to change their minds. Thus was formed a policy of limited objectives: stabilize the Saigon government, protect the cities and centers of commerce, and hold back until we could get South Vietnam ready for full Vietnamization. It was a policy that proved fatal to any hope of victory. The proof of failure of U.S. policy was the fall of Saigon in 1975. During World War II, did America encourage Belgium, Holland, France, and Denmark to liberate themselves with our limited assistance and allow Germany to be immune from massive airstrikes? A preposterous thought. But we did exactly that in Vietnam. Within country, policies didn't enhance war fighting either. Battalion, company, and platoon commanders were replaced every 6 months. Subsequently, every 6 months, the experience level of commanders was near zero. To many men, it didn't matter if the commanders were replaced so often, because at that rate, the war would last forever. Let the careerists get their tickets punched. The Tet Offensive of 1968 proved to be a military disaster for Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army units in South Vietnam. Entire units that took years to build were wiped out. U.S. troops inflicted 50,000 enemy casualties while sustaining 4,000 killed and wounded. American military might had held the line, counterattacking on a dozen fronts and retaking every piece of terrain the enemy had captured. The VC and NVA were never able to mount such an attack again until after the American troops pulled out. Whatever the military losses for the NVA, their political gain in the United States was a watershed. Aided by leftist groups, liberal congressmen, and a hostile media, the NVA military failure was transformed into a victory. The media created panic in the United States. Walter Cronkite asked who was winning this war. Every night, television news reports would replay an impression that the American soldier and Marine had failed. The leftists in and out of government had a different battle cry. An indecisive Congress and president fought each other. America would never achieve total military victory in Vietnam. The most she could hope for was to turn the mess over to the South Vietnamese in reasonable order and to deploy home. By mid-1969, the first American combat units began to withdraw, primarily from the Mekong Delta. Many North Vietnamese Army units had consolidated into sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos to avoid destruction. The die was cast. The Americans would eventually leave, and the NVA simply needed to take their time. The NVA strategy would be to avoid decisive action, but keep up the pressure and to inflict as many casualties as possible on the Americans. Vietnamization and American pullout had begun. Who wants to be the last casualty in a no-win war? In 1969 and 70, a group of young American soldiers came together from all over the United States to fight a war in Vietnam which they were not allowed to win. Their unit was 3rd Platoon, Company C, 4th Battalion, 12th Infantry, 199th Light Infantry Brigade. What follows is their story. The men of the 3rd Platoon arrived in Vietnam the same way and began the lonely ride to join their unit. On the highway from Saigon to Bien Hoa, the GIs received their first exposure to Vietnam. From former French rubber plantations to village scenes that would become so familiar during their tour of duty, Vietnamese modes of transportation were a stark contrast to those used by the American military. Lambrettas were used to haul everything from people to lumber, while the traditional ox still remained popular. Open-air markets dotted the roadside, and South Vietnamese positions guarded agricultural and industrial sites. An elaborate brigade main base, Camp Frenzel Jones, was constructed at Long Bin. It had every conceivable convenience: officer, NCO, and enlisted clubs with entertainment and food, a swimming pool, air-conditioned library, outdoor movies, PX, snack bar, and access to TV to watch the Armed Forces Television Network. The BMB was a great place, but drugs began to relieve the boredom of the support troops. A small group of soldiers, particularly militant blacks, began to accept courts-martial in lieu of hazardous duty in the field. The 3rd Platoon infantrymen carried about 60 pounds of gear, usually 3 bandoliers of 7 M16 magazines each, 2 fragmentation grenades, 1 Claymore mine, 1 pound of C4 explosives, protective mask, bayonet or machete, several smoke grenades, trip flares, sea rations for 3 days, which meant 9 meals, 4 or 5 quarts of water, an entrenching tool, sleeping gear, web gear, rucksack, sometimes a light anti-tank rocket, and a steel helmet. The special weapons machine gunner, his ammo bearer, and grenadier carried even more. The platoon organization was usually made up of 3 squads and their squad leaders, a platoon sergeant with his radio telephone operator, or RTO, a platoon leader with his RTO, and a platoon medic. A Kit Carson scout was assigned to the platoon. A scout was a former VC or NVA soldier that defected, often after he was wounded or captured. He was paid as a mercenary, getting $50 a month. His job was to advise the platoon of signs of VC and NVA activity. Frequently, they spoke only Vietnamese. Missions in the Triple Canopy jungle lasted an average of 17 to 21 days. Normally, the platoon and company were inserted in a small landing zone in the jungle by UH-1 helicopter. Because of the thickness of the vegetation, the platoon would form a single file, take an azimuth, and walk for days looking for NVA, VC, enemy base camps, and hidden supply caches. They could check their location with artillery spotter rounds, bursting in the air at known grids. Operating in the jungle for days and weeks meant incessant movement through heat and humidity, leeches, malaria, jungle rot, ringworm, and countless other horrors. Every cut became infected, and occasionally there were illnesses that baffled the doctors. A man would only be evacuated when his malarial fever reached 105 degrees, or when fever from infection prevented him from keeping up. Each band was a precious resource. There was real, precious strength in numbers in this war, an ironic twist that a nation of nearly 200 million people would depend on so few men. The days of the week and even the months were lost. No one knew anymore. They only knew how many days they had been out on this mission, and whether or not this was the rainy season. They moved by day and ambushed trails at night. Each day they looked for signs of the enemy, fresh trails or bunker-sized trees cut on the perimeter of base camps, a lesson quickly taught to Lieutenant Eubanks by Merle Barrett. It became apparent that almost all bunker complexes were supported by an all-season stream. The NVA needed a source of water to drink, bathe, sometimes fish, and remove debris and waste that might give away the position. Trails always led in and out, but sometimes by secret routes. Chance meetings with the NVA could be fatal. Moving through the jungle single file leaves little firepower forward. If the NVA heard Americans coming, a hasty rocket-propelled grenade ambush could be devastating, especially if followed by 82mm mortars. The effect was superior firepower for the first few deadly minutes. Unlike the enemy, American troops didn't enter the field with their 14-man mortar platoon. Most Americans thought the warriors were fighting against a few armed civilians who placed booby traps and took sniper shots. In reality, there were no civilians in the jungle and no booby traps. Such was the case when Lieutenant Jurek, Sergeant Franklin, the Kit Carson scout, and Osborne Mattingly were killed. The 3rd Platoon returned to the BMB every 45 to 50 days for a 2-day stand down. Once back at BMB, it was difficult to accept leaving and returning to the hell of the jungle. The soldiers would have been better off never seeing a BMB, except for in-and-out processing from South Vietnam. In the Long Con and Ben Thuy provinces of South Vietnam, the 199th Light Infantry Brigade's nemesis was the 33rd North Vietnamese Army Regiment, assisted by the 274th Viet Cong Regiment. The NVA regiment never deployed out of South Vietnam. A majority of the regiment had moved west across the Dong Nai River in War Zone D, 35 to 40 kilometers from the Cambodian border, in northwest Long Con province. A supply line from Cambodia could be established by the NVA, and American soldiers of the 199th were not based north of the Dong Nai. Fire Support Base Nancy was 10 kilometers west of the Dong Nai. It had been established in 1969 to block the 33rd Regiment from moving across the Dong Nai and into the western edge of the Binh Thuy province. Intelligence reported that by the fall of 1969, the 33rd Regiment was to mount an offensive into the Din Quan and Vo Dat areas to secure supplies, primarily rice and taxes, and to engage enemy units. Massive B-52 strikes northwest and southeast of the Dong Nai River and aggressive company-sized patrols by the 4th Battalion Warriors, including Company C, blunted the 33rd's movement through Din Quan district. The enemy began to infiltrate small units through the 4th Battalion sector into the Vo Dat and Vo Su areas to consolidate into larger units. The Vo Dat and Vo Su areas were important to both the Americans and the NVA. Their populations were sympathetic to the VC and NVA and would provide them with food, information, and security. During the late fall of 1969, the Warriors continued to recon avenues of approach through the areas around Din Quan and Vo Dat. In response, the enemy infiltrated special units around Vo Dat and Vo Su and would attack the MAC-V and RFPF compounds every few nights with mortars. Fire Support Base Nancy was avoided by the NVA because they didn't want to alert the Americans that they were moving into the area before they were ready. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had developed a secret government that replicated every echelon of the Saigon government, from the national level down to the village. This organization was known as the Viet Cong Infrastructure, or VCI. If the U.S. and South Vietnamese had driven all of the enemy from the area, the VCI remained to intimidate and report on government collaborators, collect taxes, cache food supplies, and maintain weapons caches. The presence of the enemy was maintained in every village and district in South Vietnam by the VCI. Only in 1969 did U.S. forces attempt to eliminate the VCI in what was called Operation Phoenix. The United States Congress would later call it assassination. On 10 December 1969, the Assistant Secretary of the Communist Party in the Din Quan district and an aide were carrying coded documents to NVA and VC units. They were traveling south of Din Quan, heading southwest toward Vo Dat, when they were ambushed and killed by 3rd Platoon Company C. The orders they were carrying announced a 6-day offensive to begin 10 December. The orders were never delivered. The battalion received credit for 2 VC infrastructure killed. This small operation symbolizes the great success by the Warriors and South Vietnamese Army in destroying the VCI in Long Con province. It was an example of successful special operations against VCI in South Vietnam. By December of 1969, combat units were pulling out of Vietnam, and rumors of the brigade leaving began to spread. The rumors became so rampant that the commanding general of the brigade warned his battalion commanders that there was no basis for the rumor of leaving, and that the rumors were detrimental to morale. Tough objectives were taken only by massive firepower and steel courage, or in the case of the 3rd Platoon on 21 December 1969, by stealth and aggressive action. A lone squad of the 3rd Platoon was sent by the company commander to locate the landing zone where the company was to be extracted the following morning. They noticed several old bombed-out enemy bunkers and a few trails leading toward a stream. Leading to the stream and the other side was a fresh trail moving slightly uphill and to the right. The platoon leader, with Larry Vidito, moved into the stream and saw a bare footprint. Lieutenant Eubanks reported to the CO and was told to return to the company position. The squad lay in silence, watching the trail and listening. The LT didn't want to disobey his captain, but was so intent on finding the enemy that he couldn't pass up this opportunity. Someone was there. He directed the squad through the stream to the other side. They were not carrying heavy gear, so they were silent. Vidito was on point. Lambert and the lieutenant were close by. Vidito caught the shadow of 2 VC walking toward him and fired, but apparently missed. The lieutenant was right behind and formed the squad on line, and they rushed forward, firing. Vidito, Chernak, Black, and Eubanks tossed grenades in bunkers as they went. The VC were so surprised the Americans were on them, they fled in panic, leaving everything behind. The enemy never attempted much of a fight. The squad was lucky they had encountered enemy bunkers, but the enemy had been caught completely off guard. Food was found boiling in water. What the squad had uncovered was exactly what Company C had been sent to find. an arms manufacturing and resupply point. After careful examination, it was discovered that the bunker complex contained a large kitchen and mess hall, a radio repair shop, a classroom filled with technical manuals, an aid station with medical supplies, and a large grenade manufacturing facility. Huge quantities of documents, letters, and supplies revealed the extent and significance of the complex. A valuable asset was lost to the VC and the NVA without a single U.S. casualty. Victory was bittersweet, as no enemy bodies were found, but the CO reported several blood trails leading out of the complex. 2 days later, fresh graves were discovered in the area, the result of the attack on the bunker complex. The 3rd Platoon's reward was to be left in the area to ambush more trails, while the rest of the company was extracted to secure FSB Nancy. 3rd Platoon's sea rations had run out, and it was too dangerous to resupply them. In January of 1970, battalions of the 33rd Regiment had infiltrated into the 199th Brigade area. The entire 14-man mortar platoon, except for 1 man, was wiped out, most likely by sabotage. On 31 January, an NVA unit of unknown size, supported by machine guns and mortars, furiously attacked the Charlie Company CP, located with 2nd Platoon, and a 2nd Platoon ambush patrol. American casualties totaled 2 killed and 29 wounded. For this action, 1 man was awarded the Medal of Honor. The next morning, 5 NVA bodies were found. Due to the large amount of enemy equipment and weapons recovered, it was suspected that many more enemy were killed. This action led to major strikes by company and battalion NVA units throughout the brigade sector. Charlie Company went out on another mission on 20 March. The Hot LZ was on a large rock that could only handle 1 Huey at a time. 1 Huey was shot down and completely destroyed, trapping the men already on the LZ. Other choppers were damaged in the landing. Unlike many landing zones, the NVA strongly contested the possession of this one, inflicting several U.S. casualties. Contact with the enemy, discovering their supplies, positions, and trails, occurred daily. 10 days into the mission, 3rd Platoon discovered a shot-down helicopter and was immediately ambushed on the edge of a major bunker complex. The mission culminated on 31 March, with the platoon rejoining the company for a combined assault on the complex. Enemy small arms, RPG, mortar, and machine gun fire inflicted dozens of casualties in minutes, forcing the company to withdraw. Through 11 days of fighting, the company had been reduced to about platoon strength. Also in March, Company B was pinned down by NVA automatic weapons and RPG fire, resulting in a dozen wounded. Less than 3 weeks later, FSB Din, near Vosu, was attacked by the 3rd Battalion of the NVA 33rd Regiment, supported by several special companies. The midnight attack was skillfully planned and ingeniously supported by using wire communications laid just before the attack, and a forward observer in a large tree overlooking the fire support base. The men of the 3rd Platoon helped drive back the assault, but more were wounded: Lamar, Waterman, and Lambert. Contact in the jungle became more frequent against larger units. The enemy was growing stronger and bolder, but were paying the price. U.S. forces were suffering casualties too, and were not being replaced. Field units became more under strength, stretched thin over an expanded area of operations, and with insufficient intelligence to trap the enemy. The 4th Battalion never engaged significant enemy units, except by meeting engagement or by the enemy's initiative. By mid-1970, the battalion was over 200 men below its authorized strength of 825 men. The 199th Light Infantry Brigade suffered approximately 325 killed and wounded every 3 months, but replacements were not coming in fast enough. By July 1970, the 2nd Battalion of the 33rd NVA Regiment had attacked another 199th Fire Base and lost 25 in action. D Troop, 17th Cavalry, was attacked on 2 occasions. The NVA lost 15 killed, but not before they destroyed 2 armored personnel carriers and 2 Sheridan tanks. From August 1969 to August 1970, FSB Nancy was never fired upon. The NVA infiltration of the 33rd Regiment was successful, as was the mission of attacking and keeping the pressure on. The 33rd Regiment had several advantages. They knew the terrain and the transportation network. They were surrounded by a sympathetic civilian population, or at worst, civilians who were neutral. And the area of operation was too large for the warriors to secure. The enemy's intelligence network was superior. This cat-and-mouse game of deadly proportion would continue until the 199th Light Infantry Brigade was deactivated at Fort Benning, Georgia, in October of 1970. Each man in the 3rd Platoon knew that the war was nearly over for the Americans in Vietnam. It was obvious that going from place to place or returning to the same location over and over, there weren't enough soldiers in the warriors' area of operation to seize and hold terrain. The NVA knew the Americans were short-handed, but they couldn't hold the terrain either. Every man who did his best, who kept the faith with his platoon, and who came home to take the abuse of his fellow citizens and suffer the neglect of leadership and government, returned as the finest American infantrymen. During their service, the 199th Brigade suffered casualties of over 650 killed and thousands more wounded. They kept faith with each other long after the President, Congress, generals, and millions of Americans turned their backs on them. We shall never forget the hundreds of individual selfless acts of courage by soldiers for fellow soldiers. After Hanbury's squad was ambushed, the platoon was reorganized into 2 squads of about 11 men each. Only after all of his men were medevaced did Hanbury report being wounded, and then only to the medic. He had a shrapnel wound completely through his leg. It would be 20 years before he would receive the Purple Heart. Milliman and Satterley were the most seriously wounded. Their platoon never saw them again. Many of the quiet acts of bravery by the men of the 3rd Platoon went unnoticed by outside command. Hanbury's refusing to be evacuated, though painfully wounded. Doc Wright and Doc Sisler, who were always there to provide medical aid to their men despite the risk. Chernak, wounded on 26 and 31 March, was chosen for the relatively safe assignment in the mortar platoon, but gave it to another 3rd Platoon soldier to remain in the field. He covered the withdrawal of his platoon all alone while being attacked by NVA soldiers. Only his quick action of setting up a Claymore ambush stopped the NVA from attacking the platoon wounded who were being evacuated. Stolzmann acted without hesitation in dropping a VCI at close range. Vidito and the lone squad for pressing forward and not thinking of backing down. Black for leading his squad with determination and courage. Lambert for being more determined as the fighting became more intense. Beverly for consistently seeing that his wounded buddies were safely attached to the jungle penetrator. The list of heroes goes on. Waterman, Ring, Hughes, Beverly, Lamar, Milliman, Neal, Satterley, Vidito, Stolzmann, Hanbury, Wilkins, Lambert, Chernak, Barrett, Steinmetz, Mattingly, Black, Rodriguez, Eubanks. For the survivors, every wounded man was agony, and each death hell. But some deaths hurt more than others, as in the case of Ozzie Mattingly. He was a young man from Kentucky who was liked by everyone. His death has been felt by his fellow soldiers for the past 20 years. The 3rd Platoon remembers all of their fallen comrades. They love and respect all of them. But with Ozzie, it is a deep hurt and sadness that will never subside. On Memorial Day weekend, 1990, 20 years after returning home from Vietnam, 9 men of the 3rd Platoon gathered in Washington, D.C. for their first reunion. Gerald Lamar, Ray Black, Andy Chernak, and Merle Barrett presided over a wreath-laying ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery at the Tomb of the Unknowns. Most of the men at the reunion had not seen each other since returning home, but the esprit, fighting spirit, and caring for each other that endured in battle was still there.